Welcome everyone to the February 4th edition of the OMR Architecture Meeting. Today we have a number of topics to talk through. I don't think any one of them is particularly deep, but there are a number of them, so hopefully we can make it through them all. To begin with, this week, I'd like to have Philip share an update on some of the work that he and Jan Vrani have been doing to enable a RISC-V CI pipeline as part of our builds. And as you know, they've been working on that for about a couple of months now. So maybe I'll just turn it over to Philip to give us a quick update on where that's at.
Thanks, Cyril. So this has not been rehearsed. Just gonna spill my brain. So we got a Debian 10 machine from I think we re-imaged one of our existing x86 machines. So the guys over at OpenG9 helped us with that on the infrastructure side. We had the machine pretty much clean slate. I documented a Docker file, which is pretty much a guide to how to set up the cross compilation with what Jan has done. So he pretty much did all the legwork there. I just kind of consolidated all the information in one place, and it requires us to build, I guess, a RISC-V cross compile toolchain root file system on Debian 10, and you can use that in QEMU to actually do the emulation of RISC-V compiled code. So that's all been done. Jan then got to work on actually enabling the CI pipeline. We had a bunch of CMake work to sort out, but right now we've merged that actually yesterday, and I've enabled it by default since. So you should see RISC-V cross compilation builds running as part of build all trigger on Jenkins. The runs take about 50 minutes or so. So we're going to monitor for the next couple of weeks to see if people are waiting on the PRs for too long. And if so, we can probably ask for another machine to be re-imaged so we can add it to our build farm and alleviate some of the stresses there. So I guess for reference, our second slowest build takes about 25 minutes or so. So it kind of doubles our time to get testing done. But I think it might be a worthwhile trade because it doesn't seem like we merge too many PRs per day anyway. So I think it's fine to get, the trade-off is fine to get RISC-V tested. So that's pretty much where we're at. I guess the goal has been achieved. We're going to stop progressing RISC-V moving forward because the test will fail if we have a change that comes in. So people will need to address that.
All right, cool. Thanks, Philip. So I guess one question is, I noticed that there is a RISC-V pipeline failure in some of the PRs that are running today. That's a known infrastructure issue that's being worked on? Is that correct?
We had an issue flagged yesterday, so we had to do some. We had to define some environment variable, which had to be done on the Eclipse side. So Adam put in a change, and it was working, and then something made it reset. So he's tracking that down. Something on the Eclipse side made it reset. So if you do see failures, flag me in them, and we'll take a look.
Okay. Yep. I saw one just a couple of hours ago. I'll look into that after the call.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I mean, do your due diligence. Like, if you're a committer, if the change is obviously not RISC-V related and it's not introducing new tests, chances are nothing's going to fail until we fix these kind of infrastructure type issues. You can go on ahead and merge even if the RISC-V fails. Yeah. Just use your common sense, I guess.
Yep. Okay, sounds good. And thank you and Jan for all the work that you put into getting this important piece of infrastructure in. I know that it's something that we've needed for some time. So thanks, guys. Any questions from anyone on that?
Yeah, just like to second Daryl's comments, and apologize if this is kind of an obvious question. I haven't dug into the details, but is JIT Builder being built on RISC-V, and if so, are the JIT Builder tests running there too?
It is, and they are. The only thing that's disabled is DDR.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on to the next item on the agenda. Sort of a last minute addition that Philip asked to insert here to talk about deprecating the prefetch insertion optimization. So turn it back over to Philip.
Okay, so I tried to dig this one back to, I guess, 2009 when it was first introduced internally in our history, and I can't find where exactly we disabled it, but I guess to summarize, this optimization, what it does is it introduces additional loads from arrays, and it attempts to prefetch their values. So it is currently disabled by default for forward arrays, and it is disabled by default under concurrent scavenge. This is a recent bug that we found. And it is only enabled for backwards array traversals. The actual algorithm to analyze all the trees and figure out the right insertion points is an n-squared algorithm. So I believe we can save quite a bit of compile time by just not doing this. And I've tried to dig back to see what drove this optimization in the first place, and I couldn't really find it. At least on Z in last several iterations of the hardware, software prefetching has been discouraged because the hardware has improved greatly in that respect. So I wanted to get a feel, or if somebody knows the history behind this optimization, or why it was introduced, because it seems severely kneecapped at the moment, and we're spending compile time needlessly.
I don't remember the app that this was for, but it's certainly possible that it no longer provides a benefit, especially in the state that you say it's in.
It's quite problematic for the GC because we used to have tail heap padding, so a couple of extra words at the end of the heap, which were allocated by the GC to make this optimization work. But since they've gotten rid of that, you can't no longer prefetch anything towards the edge of the heap, which means you could get a SIG bus failure, for example, by inserting prefetches in the forward direction, which is probably why it was disabled. And in the backwards direction, we now have modified, for example, for OpenG9, we modified the object headers to include something that looks like a pointer right before the start of an array. So if you prefetch backwards, you could load a value which looks like a real object, and then things like concurrent scavenge would fail. So there's all sorts of weird issues regarding this op because it inserts loads which don't exist in the program at the moment.
I only have a fuzzy fuzzy interaction with prefetch insertion over the years. I have a suspicion it was introduced for power and to catch some opportunity that it was looking for. I don't remember the history behind it at all. Not that I've gone looking for it either. But is there anybody that's got a power? Gita, perhaps? Do you recall if this is a historical optimization that is still needed on power?
It might have been one of those older spec scenarios, maybe, that drove it, if it was coming from power 10 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we could turn it off and do a bunch of performance runs with it to see if there's any benefit that it's providing. But if it is such a expensive piece of technical debt with an n-squared algorithm and it's providing no benefit or very, very, very little, then I would tend to agree that it's something that we could consider removing.
I don't have objections to removing, but we should do some perf study before it, maybe on power.
Yeah, and I maybe getting other Eunice's opinion or Gita and Julian as well to see if they remember anything with this. But yeah, doing the perf work I think is the next step to getting rid of it.
So is this included by default in the compilation strategies in OMR?
I don't know the answer to that. Maybe.
Either.
Okay.
I doubt it's included in warm.
Yeah, talking about power, I would ask Julian. To be honest, I don't know.
Okay.
He might have more background.
Maybe you could open an issue, Philip, just for discussion on this. You can track some of the discussion on it.
Yep,
Proposing
that's
that
my
we
next.
remove it.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Okay. Is there any more discussion anyone wants to have on prefetch insertion? For its prefetch removal, I guess, is the where it's possibly heading. Okay. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so the next three topics that I have in the agenda here really came about this week because of some work that happened earlier this week by someone who's not normally affiliated with the project, where they went and implemented some feature, and it turned out that there wasn't necessarily consensus yet from people in the community on whether or not that was such a good idea to implement. So what I thought that we could do is I went through some of the older issues that we have opened and have opened for some time that are looking for help. And I just want to make sure that the community has had an opportunity to at least consider it and put forth a consensus that it is something that we want to do. And if not, I guess the issue should be closed, or if we needed to refine it in some way, we can change the issue itself. So I've picked three from the history. If you're really sharp, you would have saw that I had four initially. That fourth one, I wanted to do a little bit of study on that myself, just to understand what that is really all about and whether it even applies anymore. It had to do with the VP handlers, but we can always revisit that at another time. So, so the first one here is it's issue 5648. I think Ben actually opened this one last fall, but there are two APIs that exist on the Node class in the compiler that are there apparently to provide more readability to the code. So there's one function called isSingleRef, which all it does is check whether or not the node's reference count is 1. And then there is a second API, isSingleRefUnevaluated, which checks if the reference count on a node is 1 and a register has not been set on that node. And when a register is not set on a node, that is usually an indication that that node has never been evaluated by the code generator. So we haven't actually produced any instructions for that node before. So we have pretty much come upon it for the first time. I guess you can think of it that way. So the question is whether or not we want to endorse this kind of like the use of these APIs. Now, I will say that these APIs have, so personally, I didn't even know they existed until a few days ago. They've been around for many years, actually, and in fact, they even predate the open sourcing of the code base. So they have had some use in the past, but first of all, I'm not convinced personally that the use should be broadened. And in fact, maybe even the places that are using it right now, we could potentially consider undoing it if that's what the community wants to do. So maybe I'll stop there before adding more thoughts to this to see if others, if they understand the issue and if you have any opinions on which way to go with this kind of a feature.
I'm personally indifferent, but I do think we should all be either using it or not using it.
Okay, so so I have concerns over using those APIs, and mainly because of the ambiguity that it is potentially introducing. I think the motivation for using them is readability, but I'm personally I'm not really convinced that readability is a concern, and I would hate to be adding the use of an API that is potentially ambiguous depending on the context in which it's used, and making that widespread throughout the code base. So if I had to make an opinion, I would say we don't adopt this.
So this is the API which could return a different answer in the code gen, right? Where reference counts are being decremented as you go along. So if you see it the first time, it may have reference count more than one, but the last time it'll have one, and it could well return true for that.
You may not be getting the answer that it may not be answering the question that you are actually asking, right? Because there are situations where the code generator will decrement the reference count on a node without updating the register. So for example, if it's evaluating a constant and that constant fits into the instruction itself and it doesn't need a register, then it'll evaluate, decrement the reference count, and then the register field will still stay empty. So it's not like if you're using this API to discover the first time you've come across the first and only time you see a node. So I have a single the reference count is 1 and it's unevaluated. If you're using that logic to conclude that this is the one and only reference to this node, and I've never seen it before, I think that's not the right conclude that in the code generator. You may be able to conclude that in the no, actually, no, I think you no, I don't think you could conclude that in the optimizer either, could you?
Well, I don't know what unevaluated even means in the optimizer.
Yeah.
Yeah, the optimizer uses a different mechanism for figuring out that sort of thing.
Yeah,
so it looks like all the existing uses are in the code generator right now. But I think I agree with you, Daryl, based on just the reasoning you just mentioned, that there is that kind of ambiguity in what does it mean for a node not to have a register on it?
I think we're taking liberty with the IL if you're evaluating something and not assigning a register. That's just us being smart about things. So for example, in your constant case, if you have a constant which has one reference and it doesn't have a register, well, why would I assign a register to it when it's just going to die immediately anyways?
Right.
But technically we should be doing that.
Right.
I mean, in those cases you're talking about where we're looking at constants and things like that, you could technically argue that node was never actually evaluated because we never actually call CG evaluate on it. I agree it's a bit ambiguous what exactly single ref unevaluated means.
Yeah, constants is one example. I think that there are other places where over the years the code generators have taken some liberties on skipping evaluations in certain contexts in order to force certain behavior to occur. That sounds very ambiguous in itself, but I can't think of another example off the top of my head. But yeah, there are. I know there are other situations that you can find in the code generators that do avoid decrementing reference counts to serve some other purpose.
Well, in principle, can't some evaluator fold a tree underneath a node without necessarily evaluating all the nodes underneath?
If it, I think at some level though, you'd still need to decrement
Do the evaluation. Yeah, it would have to dec the reference count, right?
Yeah, I mean, memory reference is the prime example of that, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Now, if we wanted it, so if we did think that there was some value here, I think that if we could think of a different API question to be asking, then that might be something that could be used. So what are you trying to say? What do you really want to know when you're asking, is single ref unevaluated? Are you asking, is this the one and only reference to this node? And if so, perhaps that's what the name of the API should be. And I guess, depending on if you're in the code generator or not, you could answer that question different ways, depending on what you have knowledge of. As long as you're able to answer that question exactly the same way. Oh, but of course, sorry, I'm just talking in circles here. Like what Vijay was saying, unevaluated doesn't really have any.
I don't think this is worth our time. There's 58 uses of it, and it's primarily in the Z cogen only. So I think it's less work just getting rid of it rather than changing every single other cogen with this ambiguity.
Okay.
There's
I would be
nothing
in favor of
unambiguous
that.
about calling the get reference count and get register.
Okay.
I do
All
agree
right,
with
we can
Daryl
drop-
that it's possible there's some other question that could be asked that would be the right question and could be unambiguously answered. But I think is single ref unevaluated feels to me like a kind of, it's almost like an identity-based kind of query, right? The question you're asking is a proxy for what you're actually trying to figure out. So we should really just ask the right question if we want to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think.
Go ahead, Gita.
But the truth is that count one no register. It's so common. It's like all over it's used all the time, right? That combination.
Yes, but it's probably used in different. Well, it may be the case that you're always asking that question to get the right, like that question is the right proxy for the thing you're actually wanting to know. But once you kind of institutionalize the question, then you run the risk that somebody will use it for the wrong reason.
That's true, yeah. But
so if we were going to keep this because we find it useful to have those two things be asked at the same time, I'd prefer that we come up with a better name for the query that we're asking so that it actually is the question that we're asking in all of those cases. And if we need to implement two things and answer it the same way, then either we haven't come up with the right name for it, or it's, maybe there is some difference that needs to get captured there. Anyway, I mean, we're talking after we've figured out the solution here, so.
Yeah. So what I'm going to propose is just dropping a comment in that issue, explaining our our discussion here. And closing the issue off. Actually, maybe we could, well, either we create a new issue to remove or to replace the uses in the Z code gen, or we just repurpose that issue to do that work. Maybe we can do that if Ben doesn't object.
I have no objections.
Okay. All right.
I think this was something that was pointed out to Philip to me on PR like a year ago or something. So I don't recall what the reasoning was.
Okay. All right. So we'll do that. If I had a gavel, I'd be smacking it on the table right now. So, all right, let's go on to the next one. All right. So issue 5663. So this is to avoid using the trcomp thread local storage query in the Z InstOpCode utility functions. So there are a number of utility functions for the Z opcodes, the Z instruction opcodes, that need to do a query on the compilation object. But rather than passing in the compilation object, each one of them does a query through trcomp, which is a thread local storage lookup. TLS lookup tends to be, it should really be used as a last resort in some places, and it is a somewhat expensive operation. I think it is considerably more expensive than simply passing in the compilation object to each of those utility functions and then using that instead. So this work proposes getting rid of trcomp usage in all those utility functions and simply passing in the compilation object. So you have to go around to all the code and change that. Any thoughts on that? I guess I think would be, is there a drawback to doing it that way? Okay, well, if there's no opinion, I can mark in the issue that it's been discussed and agreed to.
Looks good to me.
Okay. The next one is standardizing the compiler getter setter syntax, so 4575. So this actually came out of a discussion in some issue, or a PR, I can't remember when it was, a while ago, like a long while ago. When the compiler code was first written, 20 years ago, and for a good part of its life, the convention being used for getters and setters was to use get, followed by the field name, and set followed by the field name. However, over time, another format has started to creep into the code, and is actually prevalent in a lot of places in the code, which is, I think, an attempt to make the code more readable. But for the getters, it's to omit the get and then just use the field name with, use the field name with a like as a function. So it's like it would be lowercase or something like that. But you're just using a function name rather than get field. So from a code consistency point of view, it would be nice if we had if we could decide on which way we wanted to go, one way or the other, and standardize that throughout the compiler, just so that we don't have that level of inconsistency. It does seem a bit, it may seem a bit like a waste of time to come up with this, but I think just from a consistency point of view and making the code base homogeneous, it could be useful to do, and it's easy for us to check, like in code reviews and things like that, that someone is doing the right thing. So I guess the question is, which format is preferable? And personally, I don't have too much of an opinion one way or the other. If anything, I would maybe favor the original way of doing it just for historical reasons, but I'm completely open either way. Anybody want to raise an opinion on this one?
I'll bite on this one. Personally, I prefer the get prefix because of the fuzzy searches in various IDs where you can just type in whatever object, arrow, get, and then whatever thing you're looking for and find the right function.
Yeah, that's a good.
Or just to see what
case part.
public things does this object expose. I always type in get and then see what can I get from you.
I hadn't actually thought of that, so that's actually a good reason to pull me off the fence too, where I would otherwise be sitting.
Same with kind of Boolean questions. I always use is or has.
Yeah, I think I do that as well. Jot that down because maybe we could roll. If that's something that people are in agreement with as well, we can propose that in the issue too. Okay, if there's no other opinions on this, I don't have to sit here thinking about it. So we'll just update that issue again with the fact that we've discussed this, and appears to be a consensus toward
I think the second
way.
part of this, the question there is important. What does a setter return? I think returning the value, the updated value, could potentially result in a chain of get, and then like a set somewhere in the middle, and then a bunch of other gets or something, which could be very, very tricky to see. If you're updating something, returning a void, you have to ensure that it ends there.
Okay, so you're arguing for the void.
I would think so, yeah. I'm just seeing people could potentially put a setter right in the middle of like 7 getters, and then you would be none the wiser.
Now, I know the setter returning a value was one of the ways that it was done from day one, but I don't think I've ever seen it used in any context where the return value of the setter was actually used for anything.
I see it in the codegen quite often because people do set register, like return set register.
Okay, I don't think I've seen that. Okay.
So I use that idiom in JIT Builder for some kinds of initialization, just because it makes for a nice kind of take the object, then arrow set this, arrow set this, arrow set this, arrow set this, and it just kind of lays it out nicely for initializing the object or updating the object if you need to do something like that.
So that would mean the setter returns the instance object, not the actual new value.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I misinterpreted what you were describing earlier. Then. Yeah, that's a case where the setter returns the object that had something set on it.
Right, but what you just proposed, Mark, I have seen that as an interesting pattern to use. Like maybe that's the way that it should be. It returns the receiver.
Yeah, there's a name for that pattern. Probably somebody else on the call knows the name for that.
Mm-hmm. That would be more useful than returning the value that you had just set. I would think.
Yeah, to me that's non-intuitive. Which is, I guess, why my brain leapt to what I did rather than what Philip said. Sorry, Philip.
Okay. Okay, we can. There's no disagreement on that. We'll put that in the issue as well. Okay, any more discussion people want to have on this one? Nope. Okay, so I'll go on to self or size optimized builds. I just need to check, is Nazim on the call? No, I don't think he's not. So, okay, I'll try and talk through this one then. So there has been some, I mean, certainly the OMR project has received some feedback in the past about the sizes of the shared objects that are produced when things are built. In some environments where you want a compiler used, for example, the expectation is that it's as tiny as possible, using only the minimal amount of features necessary to produce code and produce code well. And in some instances, there may be some things that get built into the compiler or other parts of OMR that aren't really necessary in all configurations. So one example that I will give, and this is not the only example, but it's just one thing that we have found when we did poke into this a bit, was the GPU support in the JIT and in the compiler, and some of the things that that get pulled in with that. Now, this isn't so much of an OMR consideration. It's maybe more of a concern in downstream projects like OpenJ9, which will pull in a lot more from that. But the idea here is, for something like that, we could have prevented that from happening if we were able to do a build that excluded certain things from a size optimized build. So if you're really concerned about producing the smallest possible size, here's a build option that you can use to guard code that you would potentially consider to be optional. Now, that's one way of thinking of it, but perhaps the other way of thinking of it is, if we know that we're implementing some feature that we know shouldn't be, that may not be useful, or may not be useful in all sizes of builds, perhaps all of these sorts of features should actually have their own kind of option where you can, or build option where you could enable it or disable it. So you could build it in or build it out if you want. And that way you could control, you have more refinement over how you are controlling what gets included in your build, or what feature gets included in your build and what doesn't. Now, like, we already do that at sort of the component level, like GC or port library or thread library, but we don't do it. Let's say if you look within the compiler, you don't see features that are that you can disable. Like, I don't want to build a certain class of, like, I don't want loop optimizations, for example, or I don't want you to do any data flow or anything like that. Or I don't want CUDA support or GPU support or SIMD support or something like that. So we don't have those kinds of options available at this point. So I'm thinking either having sort of these categories of build flags that could disable that, or we have a more general size optimized build flag that can be used to turn off sets of these things. So I'll just pause there for a sec in case there's any thoughts on that.
So does that mean we would have to put a bunch of if-defs everywhere?
Well, I guess it might be. I mean, ideally, I would think that ideally we wouldn't want to do this at too fine a granularity. It would be for fairly significant features, that's for sure.
So the original is like we used to have the small JIT, right? So then the way that was done was there was a query called isSmall that was propagated with just if statements throughout the whole code base in various places, and that isSmall was an inlined pound if def return value. So the pound if def didn't propagate everywhere, although it was necessary in places.
Well, there were two aspects of that. There was the compile time query isSmall, and then there was the actual macro, the preprocessor macro isSmall, and both of those were used throughout the code.
Yeah.
So I think what's being thought of here is more of the macro approach, to exclude something from being built altogether. So I think for this one, what needs to happen, there's no issue for it yet. I think what needs to happen is an issue needs to be created that would potentially propose a couple of different approaches for doing this, and to come up with, well, first of all, whether or not it's a good idea, if it's something that it needs, and also what is the best strategy going forward. I think there already is actually an issue that somebody created years ago in OMR to add capability kind of flags to the build. I'd have to go look for that. I've just remembered that now while I was speaking here, to see if that's still around, if there's something there can get resurrected.
I'm a little bit worried about taking sort of pieces out of optimizer, because behavior can become completely sort of unexpected. You never know. If you remove something else will not happen, right? It's not as sort of independent. All these optimizations, they pretty much depend on each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true to some extent. But maybe like I was saying before, I don't know if we can do this it depends on the granularity that we are trying to permit this at. Like, I don't think we can just, because I don't want the code to be just completely littered with if defs. I remember what it was like with the small, and how there were smalls all over the place, and that, in my opinion, is not something to go back to. But if we did this on a much greater scale, perhaps that is something that could work.
So I guess one question is, what are those larger scale things that you could just strip out en masse? Do you have some examples of those kinds of things?
I mean, the biggest thing that we found so far was all the GPU work, and the SIMD support, SIMD instruction support. Potentially, if you wanted a much like a really stripped down kind of optimizer, you're only, let's say, interested in op level cold or something like that. Potentially, you could build out all the optimizations that you don't want to enable. If you're, this could potentially extend into other parts of the GC. I'm not saying this will be easy, but just extend into other parts of the GC as well, where you're only interested in a certain kind of collector or something like that, and you only build in what you need.
For what it's worth, the way you do that without littering the code with if-staffs is you make the code modular, right? Because then you just, when you need a particular module, you pull it in, you build it, and if you don't need it, you don't pull it in, and it's not part of your build. Historically, we haven't been too good at modularizing our code. In fact, we've had several issues with kind of things being interdependent on each other to a great extent. So that's kind of where the challenge is for us.
So you would make this modular at the file level then?
Well, files is one way of doing this, yes. It's not the only way of doing it.
I agree with Leonard. Like if you go this route, like it needs to be together with some kind of modularization. I think, like some redesign, not macros.
Thing that I'm thinking of is like what devices would need that, and because we have the microJIT, I don't know how the microJIT fits in this. But yeah, like if the devices that need this are like one of the small devices, then maybe the microJIT will be the component for it.
Well, if the microJIT can be, well, there are a couple of, there are those that have taken the OMR compiler and tried to integrate it into a completely different front end than what we've traditionally been used in, and in those contexts, they discovered that it's just simply too large for their needs. But I'm not sure if, is the microJIT being designed to be used for more than just Java? Is it general enough to be used by other non-Java front ends? We don't know the answer to that.
Not right now, at least. The way the microJIT is, it's based on Java bytecodes, for sure.
Bytecodes, yeah.
And even if it wasn't, I don't think that would really address the issue here, because that basically only gives you two options: is you either have microJIT or you have full OMR. What if you need something in between that?
Well, to be fair, there are some facilities available already in the compiler that help strip things down, right? So if you don't, or if you're willing to go to the quote unquote extreme of creating your own extension of the OMR compiler, you can configure the optimizer to not include optimizations that you're not interested in. So JIT Builder does that.
Yeah, I remember Luke having to go through and make it so that we weren't initializing optimizations that we weren't using, right?
Yep,
and
that's right.
That was kind of my point about modularity, is right. That's kind of work that we had to do to make it so that we weren't pulling them in.
Right.
You're right that we can definitely create our own extensions and make it so that we don't pull in the pieces we don't need. It's just you still end up pulling in quite a bit, at least from what I remember of the experiments we did for that, or not we, but people.
Right. Well, that was work at the level of the optimizations. So if the optimizations pulled in things, then it would just kind of get pulled in. There wasn't much you could do about that. But if you were only only wanted to initialize certain optimizations, you wouldn't have to pull in everything. So I know JIT Builder saved about a megabyte of size in the JIT Builder library at the time when Luke did that. It was actually Shelley who started that refactoring work, and then Luke went through and completed the initialization so that you wouldn't have to have all of the optimizer, even if you weren't using all of it.
Yeah, I guess maybe one of the ways to approach figuring out what the right thing to do here is to think about what the how you'd want to put some of these pieces together.
Well, I think the first step is to figure out what are the pieces that you that we think are substantial pieces of code where isolating
like what's the
may have some
granularity?
significant benefit to size. And then we have to figure out how big they are or estimate how big we think they are, and then evaluate the content, how much work it would be to do something like what Leonardo's describing, or something lower tech. Maybe doing that one first just to see what the real benefit could be, and then if the benefit is large, then we can consider investing to do the modularization effort to achieve that in a more effective way.
I was just thinking that one of the good use case for this would be JIT server, where you're primarily only need a very small portion of the JIT, but might have been built currently, like most of the JIT or all of the JIT.
Yep. Right. So that would be more isolating the client from the rest of the actual guts of compiling. So that's almost going back to the code RT versus JIT split that we used to have. That's the other way of cutting it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, there's no issue for this yet, but I think probably one of the next steps is at least to create an issue to track some kind of investigation into the right way of approaching this and actually doing it. I'm not sure how much progress is going to be made on this kind of front, but in the short term at least, but at least there will be an issue where those kinds of investigations can be tracked, unless there is a very strong use case that comes up that warrants doing that work quicker. Okay. So that's all we have on the agenda for today. I guess, are there any other topics that anybody wants to bring up before we close? Nope. Okay, well, thanks for attending, everyone, and we will convene again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks.